He looked like he was going along with a gag or something. Imagine that expression. That's embedded in my mind, because it's such a strange thing to say. I saw the president stand up in the car, and it looked to me like he was going along with a gag or something. It looked funny, you know? Like jumping, somebody scared by a firecracker. Some people laugh. Well, this man was shot, and he was a veteran of World War II, and his body had instincts. And then he popped up and he sat back down. Now, here's the key thing. They discredited Mr. Newman, Mrs. Newman's statements saying that the president stood up, using the Zapruder film as the evidence that the car never stopped and the president never stood up. And yet, Mr. Zapruder, when he testified, he said, I was shooting the motorcade and it went behind the sign and I saw the president's head pop up behind the sign. He said, no, the car never stopped. How could you see the sign was obstructing the view of the president? And he said, I saw the president's head pop up above the sign. So there you have Mr. Zapruder shooting the film with a telescopic lens. And you have Mr. Newman, who was the closest person to the president, standing on the curb. At the moment the president was shot, Mr. Newman was the closest person to the president who was not inside that car. And it happened so rapidly. Yeah, it happened so rapidly that Mr. Newman himself was fooled by the sequence of events, and he said that he had seen the president's ear shot right off. And I had seen him say that many times. I saw him debunked by Vincent Bugliosi in the trial of Lee Harvey Oswald, and I was sitting there watching him, and that was in the 80s, you know, so that's like 17 years, almost 20 years after the event, and I remembered him, and he told the story exactly as he told it on that Friday night on CBS. So Bugliosi, very officiously, comes on and says, let us see the Zapruder film. When he runs the Zapruder film, the car doesn't stop, the president doesn't jump up behind the sign, and the whole thing goes on. And then he says to Mr. Newman, he says, Mr. Newman, as you can see, the car never stopped and the president never stood up, so obviously you must be mistaken. And the poor man, what has he got to say? What can he say? He's sitting there like a fool. He's been made a fool of. But he was the one that was telling the truth, and Bugliosi was the one who was pushing the lie. So I come up and I meet Mr. Newman that day, 33 years later in Dallas, and I said, Mr. Newman, I'm here, you know, I'm an investigator, researcher. I'd like to interview you, but before I do that, I want to tell you something. I saw you that night, and I've seen you many times, and I saw you on the trial of Lee Harvey Oswald, and I saw what they did to you. Now, Mr. Newman, I want you to forget everything else that happened at that trial and what you've heard about it. I want you to tell me in your own words, exactly word for word, as you saw it that day, tell me what you saw. So I interviewed him, and I have him on camera. And then afterwards I said, Mr. Newman, I have something to tell you. And then I explained to him what I have just explained to you. And I explained to him that the illusion of the ear being shot off was actually the back of the president's head. The bone, called the mastoid bone, just blew right out. And that was about the same size as the ear, and the head twisted. So his eye followed the bone, thinking it was the ear that was shot off. And let me just tell you what happened. Mr. Newman looked old. He looked like close to 70. He looked portly, and he listened to me. And then at the end, I saw that I had made an impression on him, and he took a big breath, he sucked in his stomach, and he said, hey, anybody here want to go and get a drink? In the friendliest Texas manner. And I saw 30 years fall off this man's age, and he returned to the person he was that day, because the truth has the power to heal. And there I saw it. All of his doubts, all of his embarrassment, and all the things he'd been put through, they all dropped away, and he knew that he had been telling the truth, and that what his perceptions had revealed to him that day were the truth, and that no matter what the Zapruder film or Bugliosi or any other debunker had to say, he knew he was himself again. And it was one of the great moments of my life, to be honest with you.
Oh, that's a wonderful story. Well, you're clearly a writer. You speak like you write.
Thank you.
And it's actually a pleasure to listen to you. I would love to hear more about what you think you know that has not been put out there beyond the actual incident.
On the JFK assassination?
Yes.
The most important thing is this. The entire nation was fooled and has been maintained in a state of a kind of zombie mentality, just being fed disinformation. The most terrible thing about it, for me, is the depravity of the criminals who did this, and that the public has been persuaded that an innocent man did it all. The fact is that the public has never yet seen an actual photograph of the real President Kennedy in the morgue, or the autopsy photos. The autopsy photos that show a dead man with a single bullet wound to the right side of the head, with a kind of like a strange, ghastly look upon his face, is not President Kennedy. The person in all the autopsy, the facial pictures and the overhead shots of the body on the morgue slab there, are Officer J.D. Tippit, the man who was killed 45 minutes after the president was killed, purportedly stopping Oswald on the street. That man was surgically executed. By that I mean he was shot down in the street, but the man who assassinated him walked up to him as he lay in the street, put the gun to his temple, and fired a single shot through his head that did not exit the top of the back of the head. That body was taken instantly. 10 minutes later, less than 10 minutes later, an ambulance was there. The body disappeared. It went to a Methodist hospital, pronounced dead on arrival at 2:30 in the afternoon. It was shipped to Parkland Hospital, the same place where the president's body had been. An autopsy was run on Tippit that was finished at 3:15 p.m., signed, sealed, and delivered by Dr. Earl Rose, the coroner, Dallas County coroner. And it was that body that was presented to the Warren Commission autopsists, 3 doctors who had never in their lives performed an autopsy. 3 men who had never seen President Kennedy. They were presented with this body, and they were told what to do, where to look.
Fascinating.
Pardon me?
I said this is fascinating. And where did you get this information? I mean, how did you unearth this?
Well, the information took years and years of work. It's a synopsis that you're getting of 25, 30 years of work. But it began with a book called Best Evidence by David Lifton, where he analyzes the medical evidence and starts to point out discrepancies. And then that got me curious. I was reading that, and because I was invited to Chicago to become the first person to stand on stage and say, this Zapruder film is a fraud. This Zapruder film has been radically altered. Besides the 2 versions that were taken, they cut 10 feet of film from that. And they joined it and spliced it, but a straight joint and splice would be very obvious because everything would jump. So what they did is they cut frames and constructed partial frames that were inserted into the film using the golden mean of a ratio of 1 to 1.618. And as a result of that editing, when the chops in the film go, they are not perceived by the ordinary person because they've basically been organically sewn into the matrix of the film. But to get back to Tippit, what happened was I went to Chicago to expose the Zapruder film, and I was only allowed to present before a closed session of the world's most famous JFK researchers, including the man who had handled the film for the last 15 years and had a monopoly on it. And I call him handler because he was foisting on the public the film that the government wants the people to believe is an actual rendition of what actually happened, and actually it's not. So anyway, During that time, as I was preparing for this conference, I read up on everything I could find on the assassination